The sleek glass-walled boardroom of Sterling Capital was dead silent. Vance stood at the head of the marble table, a confident, arrogant grin plastered across his face. He adjusted the gold links on his cuffs, waiting for the final signature on a $5 million business acquisition that would solidify his status as the city's youngest venture capitalist king. "Everything is in order, Mayor," Vance, the corporate attorney, said, sliding the heavy leather folder across the table. "We just need the final authorization from the primary chairman of the Medical Investment Board." The double oak doors clicked open and Vance turned, his hand extended, ready to flash his most charming multi-million-dollar smile. But as the chairman walked into the room, Vance's smile instantly froze. The blood drained entirely from his face, his hand dropped, and his heart violently slammed against his ribs. Walking toward him in a bespoke charcoal gray three-piece suit was his elderly father, Silas. It was the same father Vance had brutally kicked out of his luxury apartment just 2 years ago. The same father who had begged him on his knees for $50,000 to fund a life-saving heart surgery. The same father Vance had looked dead in the eye and called a worthless, broke old man who was dragging him down. Silas didn't reach out to shake Vance's hand. Instead, he calmly took his seat at the center chair, the chair reserved only for the absolute owner of the entire building. He looked at his son with a cold, devastating clarity that cut straight through Vance's expensive facade. "2 years ago, Vance, you told me that my life wasn't worth $50,000. Silas's voice resonated through the room, filled with a quiet, terrifying power. "You told me that in the real world, poor people simply run out of time. So tell me, what happens to your expensive world when the man you left to die owns the very air your company breathes?" Vance felt his knees buckle. The folder lay open on the table, completely worthless, as his entire empire turned to dust right before his eyes. Welcome back to Moments and Meanings. Before we uncover the incredible twist in today's story, take a quick moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below with your thoughts on karma. Have you ever turned your back on the very person who sacrificed their whole life to build yours? We live in a world where people become so blinded by flashy luxury cars and high society status that they forget the hands that fed them when they had nothing. But the universe has a powerful way of balancing the scales. Today we are diving into a deeply emotional story about a son who refused to pay for his father's life-saving surgery, only to find out that a parent's love and a parent's secrets can completely rewrite your destiny. Let's begin. The penthouse kitchen was bathed in the harsh, pristine glow of hidden LED lights, highlighting the absolute perfection of Vance's morning routine. He stood in front of his imported Italian espresso machine, his silk robe whispering against his skin as he monitored the digital readout of his investment portfolio. At 26, Vance had successfully detached himself from his past. He was sharp, calculating, and rapidly climbing the ranks of the city's elite financial circles. His fiancée, Vivienne, glided into the kitchen, wrapped in a plush cashmere wrap. She was a woman whose entire identity was built on exclusive guest lists, designer labels, and social pedigree. She swiped through her phone, her eyes reflecting the glowing blue light of a luxury yacht rental catalog. "We need to finalize the deposit for the Monaco trip, Vance," Vivienne said, her voice dropping into an elegant, demanding purr. "The Fairmont suite is almost fully booked, and if we don't secure the private helicopter transfer by noon, we'll be forced to take a standard limousine like common tourists. My friends are already posting their itineraries." "Consider it done, babe," Vance replied, flashing a smug, confident smile. "I'm closing a massive tech merger deal with the Henderson Group this afternoon. The commission alone will cover the entire summer in Europe. I've spent months cultivating these high society connections, and they expect to see me living the part." Before Vivienne could respond, the heavy, soundproof door of the penthouse rattled with a soft, hesitant knock. Vance frowned. The concierge downstairs was strictly instructed never to send guests up without a digital security confirmation. Vance walked down the long mirrored hallway and opened the door. His breath caught in his throat, and an instant wave of irritation washed over his face. Standing in the corridor was his elderly father, Silas. Silas looked like a ghost from a world Vance had desperately tried to erase. He was wearing an old, visibly frayed brown corduroy jacket that smelled faintly of old books and sawdust. His shoes were scuffed, worn down at the heels, and his hands trembled slightly as he leaned on a cheap wooden cane. For over 30 years, Silas had worked as a humble night shift machinist at a local manufacturing plant, earning just enough to pay for Vance's expensive private high school tuition and business textbooks. Vivian peered around the corner, her nose instantly crinkling in disgust. Vance? Who is this? Is he from the charity drive? It's my father, Vivienne. Vance muttered through his teeth, his jaw clenching with intense embarrassment. He reluctantly stepped aside, allowing Silas to limp into the pristine, minimalist foyer. Hello, Vance, Silas said, his voice weak and raspy, carrying the heavy exhaustion of a man fighting a losing battle against his own body. He offered a polite, trembling nod to Vivienne. Hello, young lady. I'm sorry to drop in without a warning. I tried calling your office, Vance, but your secretary told me I wasn't on the approved contact list. I'm very busy, Dad, Vance said coldly, keeping his distance to ensure the dust from Silas's corduroy jacket didn't touch his silk robe. What are you doing here? I thought we agreed that you would stay in your apartment outside the city. If my neighbors or my colleagues see you wandering around this building, it sets a bad impression. Silas swallowed hard, his hand tightening around the handle of his wooden cane. He reached into his deep pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in an old, yellowed piece of newspaper. He placed it carefully on the white quartz island, his eyes filled with a deep, quiet hope. I didn't come to embarrass you, son, Silas whispered softly. I came because my health has taken a severe turn. The doctors at the state hospital ran the tests last week. My aortic valve is failing. They told me I need a complex, specialized heart surgery within the next month, or my heart simply won't hold out. Vance didn't move. He didn't offer a chair. He didn't even ask his father how he was feeling. He simply stared at the quartz counter. How much, Dad? The specialist at the private medical center says the surgery and the post-operative care will cost $50,000, Silas said, his voice trembling with the absolute humiliation of a father begging his child for his life. The public hospital wait list is 6 months long, Vance. I don't have 6 months. I gave everything I had to make sure you graduated college without debt, son. I don't have any savings left. Vivienne let out a sharp, mocking laugh from the living room couch, not even looking up from her phone. $50,000? Vance, that's literally the price of our first-class flights to Monaco. Does he think we're a charity foundation? Vance felt a toxic surge of superficial pride and anger bubble up in his chest. He looked at his father's frail frame, his cheap cane, and his worn shoes. To Vance's blinded mind, Silas wasn't a loving father who had sacrificed his own youth and body to build his son's future. He was a financial anchor dragging him down. A low-class old man who was threatening to ruin the high-society life Vance had fought so hard to obtain. Vance walked over to the kitchen island and unwrapped the yellowed newspaper. Inside was a heavy, unpolished brass key with a deeply intricate, old-fashioned lock pattern. It didn't have a luxury brand logo. It looked completely useless. What is this, Dad? Vance asked, his tone dripping with deep, bitter disappointment. A brass key? I asked for financial stability, and you bring me a piece of scrap metal? It's the key to our family's old wooden storage shed behind the abandoned factory on the east side, Silas explained earnestly, his eyes pooling with an emotional history Vance refused to see. Your grandfather gave it to me, and I kept it safe for you. I know it looks old and worthless on the outside, Vance, but what lies behind that key is the most valuable thing our family owns. If anything happens to me, I want you to have it. I wanted to give it to you today, hoping you would understand that family always protects its own. Vance stared at the brass key lying on the counter, then looked up at his father. The quiet, dignified love in Silas's eyes didn't waver, but a deep, tragic realization was beginning to settle over the old man's face. He finally understood that his son no longer saw him as a father. He only saw him as a burden. 1 week had passed since Silas had begged for his life in the penthouse foyer, and Vance's world was buzzing with high society excitement. The final preparations for the Monaco trip were complete, and Vance was hosting an exclusive pre-departure cocktail party. The penthouse was filled with the city's young, ruthless elite. Among them was Julian, a top-tier hedge fund manager who wore a $1,000 watch and openly mocked anyone who made less than 6 figures. Vance moved through the crowd effortlessly, sipping vintage champagne and laughing at jokes he didn't care about. He was so close to entering the billionaire class, and he could taste the victory. I have to say, Vance, Julian remarked, leaning against the quartz kitchen island while swirling a glass of expensive scotch. Your presentation for the Henderson Group merger was flawless. But I heard a strange rumor through the grapevine. Someone said they saw an old man in a ragged corduroy jacket coming out of your elevator last week. He looked like he belonged in a homeless shelter. You don't have poor relatives dragging down your brand, do you? The immediate surrounding area fell silent. Several wealthy guests turned to look at Vance, their faces filled with judgment. Vivienne narrowed her eyes, stepping up beside Vance and locking her arm tightly in his. Vance felt his collar grow suddenly tight. A cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. He couldn't let these people know the truth. Of course not, Julian. Vance lied smoothly, forced a chuckle. Probably just a confused delivery driver. I don't associate with people like that. Before Julian could respond, the penthouse intercom chimed loudly. Vance's phone buzzed with an urgent text from the front desk. Mr. Vance, your father is downstairs again. He bypassed security and is heading up to your floor. He says it's a medical emergency. Vance's heart violently slammed against his ribs. He turned toward the private elevator doors just as they slid open. Standing in the entryway was Silas. The old man looked drastically worse than he had a week ago. His face was entirely devoid of color, his breathing was shallow and labored, and he was clutching his chest with a trembling gray hand. He hadn't even worn his corduroy jacket this time. He was in a thin, faded hospital gown underneath an old flannel shirt, his plastic hospital wristband still visible. Vance, Silas rasped, his voice barely a whisper as he stumbled forward into the elegant, brightly lit living room. Please, son. The hospital called. A cancellation opened up for tomorrow morning. The surgeon can operate on my heart tomorrow, but they need the $50,000 deposit cleared tonight, or they will give the slot to someone else. I don't have another week, Vance. My heart is failing right now. The entire penthouse fell into a suffocating, dead silence. The wealthy guests stared in absolute horror and disgust. Vivienne gasped dramatically, taking a massive step back as if Silas were a walking plague. Vance, get this embarrassment out of our apartment right now. Vivienne hissed in a furious, venomous whisper. Look at him. He is ruining my party. Julian is watching. If you waste $50,000 of our vacation money on this dying old man, the wedding is off, and I will personally tell the Henderson Group that your family is a low-class disaster. Make your choice. Julian let out a cruel, condescending laugh. Is this your father, Vance? Wow, in business, Vance. We call a failing asset a bad investment. You have to know when to cut your losses. Vance looked at his wealthy friends. He looked at Vivienne, who was threatening to take away the luxurious future he had sacrificed his soul for. Then, he looked at his elderly father, the man who had skipped meals, worked double shifts in a freezing factory, and ruined his own health just so Vance could have a prestigious education. But greed is a powerful, blinding poison. Vance didn't see a father fighting for his life. He saw an obstacle to his ambition. He saw a stain on his perfect reputation. Vance stepped forward, his face hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated cruelty. What are you doing here, Dad? Vance shouted, his voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings, intentionally projecting his anger to impress the crowd. I told you never to come back here. You are embarrassing me in front of the most important people in this city. Silas blinked back tears, his frail body shaking violently as he leaned heavily on his wooden cane. Vance, I am your father. I am asking you to save my life. $50,000 is nothing to you, but it is everything to me. I raised you, son. And I don't owe you anything for that. Vance barked back, entirely consumed by his own ego. You chose to be a low-class machinist. You chose to live paycheck to paycheck. And now you expect me to fund your broken body? In the real world, old man, success goes to the strong. If you didn't manage your money well enough to afford insurance, that is your problem. Not mine. Vance marched over to the kitchen island. Resting there, entirely ignored for the past week, was the heavy, unpolished brass key wrapped in yellowed newspaper. Vance snatched it up. You brought me this piece of scrap metal and called it a legacy? Vance hissed, holding the brass key directly in front of Silas's pale face. You want me to value a key to a rotting wooden shed while I am trying to buy a villa in Monaco? This is exactly why you are a failure, Dad. You value garbage. and you expect me to do the same. With a sudden, aggressive stride, Vance walked over to the stainless steel trash can at the end of the counter. In front of Vivienne, Julian, and 30 whispering, smirking guests, Vance tossed the ancient brass key into the garbage. It hit the bottom with a loud, hollow, devastating clang. "I am not paying a single dime for your surgery, Dad," Vance said coldly, pointing a trembling, ruthless finger toward the elevator. "I am entering the billionaire class, and I will not have a broke, dying old man dragging me down to the mud. Get out of my penthouse, and don't ever call me again. As far as I'm concerned, my father died a long time ago." Silas stood frozen, his heart breaking in real time. He looked at the trash can where his family's most sacred secret had just been discarded like worthless waste. He looked at the son he had loved, sacrificed for and protected, but he no longer recognized the monster standing in front of him. Silas didn't yell. He didn't beg anymore. A quiet, tragic dignity settled over his frail shoulders. He wiped a single tear from his hollow cheek, turned his back, and walked slowly into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, cutting Silas off from his son's luxurious world, a sudden chilling silence filled the room. "Brilliant move, darling," Vivienne said, walking up and kissing Vance's cheek, her voice filled with artificial pride. "You finally proved you have what it takes to be a winner." The guests raised their champagne flutes, cheering Vance's cold heart. Vance forced a triumphant smile, entirely convinced he had just secured his empire. He had absolutely no idea he had just signed the death warrant for his own soul, and that the countdown to his absolute destruction had officially begun. 2 years had passed since the night Vance threw his dying father out into the cold, and the universe had returned his cruelty with absolute, devastating precision. The grand, glittering illusion of Vance's high society life had not just cracked, it had violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The karma began almost immediately after the infamous Monaco trip. The Henderson Group tech merger, which Vance had arrogantly banked his entire financial future on, turned out to be a massive, well-disguised corporate trap. The tech company was drowning in hidden liabilities. When the market shifted, the stock plummeted to zero, taking every single penny of Vance's heavily leveraged portfolio down with it. The descent into ruin was terrifyingly fast. The bank foreclosed on the pristine, minimalist penthouse. The luxury cars were repossessed in the middle of the night. And Vivienne, the woman who had demanded Vance abandon his father for a life of luxury, packed her expensive designer luggage the very moment Vance's black credit card was declined at a 5-star restaurant. She didn't even shed a single tear. She simply walked out the door and within a month married Julian, the ruthless hedge fund manager who had mocked Silas at the cocktail party. Now, Vance was a hollow shell of the arrogant boy he used to be. He lived in a cramped, dimly lit, one-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city, ironically, just a few miles away from the very factory where his father used to work. Vance's expensive silk robes were gone, replaced by anxiety-induced insomnia and a mountain of red-stamped final notice bills. Vance had managed to scrape together one last, desperate business venture, a boutique firm called Sterling Capital. But it was a complete facade. The company was drowning in debt, and Vance was teetering on the edge of total bankruptcy and potential prison time for financial negligence. He had one single, fragile lifeline left. Sterling Capital had brokered a $5 million acquisition deal with a massive, highly secretive conglomerate known as the Aegis Medical Investment Board. If Vance could get the primary chairman to sign the final authorization papers today, the commission would save him from prison and pull him out of the gutter. If the deal failed, Vance's life was completely over. The sleek glass-walled boardroom of Sterling Capital felt more like an execution chamber than a place of business. Vance stood at the head of the heavy marble table, his hands trembling slightly as he straightened his tie. He was wearing his last remaining designer suit, though if one looked closely, the cuffs were slightly frayed, and his watch was a cheap replica because he had pawned the original to pay for the office's electricity bill. He was sweating profusely, desperately trying to project the confident, arrogant grin of a venture capitalist king. But he felt entirely sick to his stomach. "Everything is in order, Mr. Vance," the corporate attorney said, sliding the heavy leather folder across the polished marble. "The Aegis Medical representatives have reviewed the acquisition terms. We just need the final authorization signature from their primary chairman." Good. That's good, Vance muttered, frantically wiping a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. Who exactly is this chairman? The Aegis Group bought out half the city's private hospitals in the last 18 months, but the CEO's identity has been buried behind ironclad non-disclosure agreements. The attorney adjusted his glasses. Rumor has it, sir, that he's a self-made titan. An older gentleman who came into a massive, historical fortune a couple of years ago and used it to entirely revolutionize medical funding for underprivileged patients. He's incredibly ruthless with corporate sharks but fiercely protective of his charities. Just smile, nod, and whatever you do, do not disrespect him. Vance took a deep, shaky breath, gripping the edge of the table to steady his trembling knees. I know how to handle billionaires. Just let him in. The heavy double oak doors at the end of the boardroom clicked open. Vance turned, forcing his chest out, his hand extended, ready to flash his most charming multi-million-dollar smile. He needed this $5 million like he needed oxygen. But as the chairman walked into the room, flanked by two towering, sharp-suited executive assistants, Vance's smile instantly froze. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him as pale as a ghost. His extended hand dropped to his side and his heart violently slammed against his ribs, beating so hard it felt like it would crack his sternum. Walking toward him in a bespoke, flawless charcoal gray three-piece suit was his elderly father, Silas. The transformation was so absolute, so breathtakingly cinematic, that Vance forgot how to breathe. Silas was no longer the frail dying man in a faded hospital gown. The grayish pallor of sickness was completely gone from his face, replaced by a healthy, vibrant strength. He walked with a steady, commanding posture. He still carried a cane, but it was no longer a cheap wooden crutch. It was a sleek, polished obsidian walking stick with a solid silver handle, carried purely for elegance rather than necessity. Silas radiated an unimaginable level of undisputed power, wealth, and quiet authority. He looked like a king inspecting a crumbling, pathetic kingdom. Vance's mind fractured. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic, choked gasp escaped his throat. How? He screamed internally. He had no money. His heart was failing. I left him to die. Silas didn't reach out to shake Vance's trembling hand. He didn't even acknowledge the corporate attorney. Instead, Silas calmly walked over and took his seat at the center chair of the marble table, the chair reserved only for the absolute master of the room. He placed his silver-handled cane against the table and looked up at his son with a cold, devastating clarity that cut straight through Vance's cheap, fraying facade. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. 2 years ago, Vance, you looked me dead in the eye and told me that my life wasn't worth $50,000. Silas's voice resonated through the glass-walled room, echoing with a quiet, terrifying power. You told me that in the real world, poor people simply run out of time and that success only goes to the strong. Vance felt his knees buckle. He reached out to grip the marble table, his chest heaving as the walls of the room seemed to violently spin around him. So tell me, Vance, Silas continued, leaning forward, his eyes devoid of any of the warm paternal love they once held. What happens to your expensive, arrogant world when the man you left to die in the gutter owns the very air your company breathes? The leather folder holding the $5 million contract lay open on the table, completely useless. Vance realized in one horrifying, paralyzing second that he was not the predator closing a deal. He was the prey, and he had just walked willingly into the jaws of absolute karma. The air in the boardroom turned to absolute ice. The corporate attorney for Sterling Capital froze, looking frantically back and forth between the trembling, hyperventilating Vance and the impossibly powerful, elegantly dressed older man sitting at the head of the marble table. Vance stood paralyzed, his mind violently fracturing as he tried to process the impossible reality standing in front of him. His cheap, fraying suit felt like a straitjacket. He looked at the flawless charcoal gray tailoring of his father's three-piece suit, the silver-handled cane, and the two terrifyingly sharp executive assistants standing silently behind Silas. Dad, Vance choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. His entire body shook so violently he had to grip the back of his leather chair just to stay upright. How? You were sick. You were dying. You didn't have $50,000. How are you the chairman of Aegis Medical? Silas did not smile. He did not blink. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a small, transparent evidence bag. He placed it squarely in the center of the polished marble table. Inside the bag was the heavy, unpolished brass key. The exact same key Vance had violently thrown into his penthouse trash can 2 years ago. "I didn't have $50,000, Vance," Silas said, his voice echoing flawlessly through the silent room. "But I had a legacy. A legacy you called a piece of scrap metal." Vance stared at the brass key, a sickening, terrifying knot forming deep in his stomach. "When you threw this key into the garbage in front of your wealthy friends," Silas continued, his tone carrying the weight of absolute judgment, "I realized that the son I had raised was truly dead. But the universe has a funny way of protecting the broken. The next morning, the janitor of your luxury building found this key in the dumpster. He remembered seeing me in the lobby, recognized it belonged to me, and tracked me down to return it. A poor working-class man making minimum wage showed me more grace and loyalty than my own flesh and blood." Vance's jaw dropped, a cold sweat drenching his collar. "You thought that key was just a useless piece of brass unlocking a rotting wooden shed," Silas said, leaning forward, his eyes piercing through Vance's soul. "You were so blinded by designer brands and luxury labels that you never bothered to look beneath the surface. You thought our family was nothing but a line of poor machinists. But what you didn't know, Vance, is that your grandfather didn't just work at that abandoned factory. He bought the entire lot when the original manufacturing company went bankrupt in the 1970s. Vance's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as the pieces began to violently snap together in his mind. Inside that rotting wooden shed was a heavy iron floor safe, Silas revealed, delivering the crushing blow. And inside that safe were the original, unencumbered land deeds to the entire 500-acre industrial district on the east side of the city. 2 weeks after you left me to die, the city's largest urban development group began a massive land buyout to build a new, state-of-the-art medical and technology park. They needed that specific land. They paid me $300 million for those deeds." A collective gasp escaped the corporate attorney, who dropped his pen onto the marble table. Vance let out a guttural, agonizing sob, his hands flying to his head as he stumbled backward. He had literally thrown a $300 million fortune into a garbage can just to impress a gold-digging fiancé who abandoned him the second he went broke. He had held generational world-changing wealth in his own hands, and he had discarded it like worthless waste to impress a room full of frauds. "I used the money to hire the greatest cardiac surgeons on the planet," Silas stated, his voice completely devoid of pity. "I bought my life back. And then, I used the remaining hundreds of millions to found the Aegis Medical Investment Board. I bought out this city's medical infrastructure to ensure that no elderly parent would ever be denied life-saving treatment just because their arrogant, selfish children refused to help them." The realization hit Vance like a high-speed train. He was standing in front of a billionaire. His own father was the titan he had been desperately begging for a $5 million lifeline. "Dad, I'm sorry," Vance screamed, entirely abandoning whatever shred of dignity he had left as his legs gave out. He crashed to his knees on the hard boardroom floor, crawling toward the head of the table. Tears streamed down his pale, panicked face, ruining his cheap tie. "Please. I didn't know. You have to understand. Vivienne manipulated me. Julian pressured me. I was stressed about the tech merger. I didn't mean the things I said." He reached out to grab the edge of his father's tailored trousers, weeping like a terrified child. "Please, Dad. Save me." Vance begged, his voice echoing pitifully. "My company is drowning. I am millions in debt. If Aegis doesn't sign this acquisition today, the authorities are going to arrest me for financial negligence. I'll go to prison. I have nothing. I'm your son, please, we are family." Silas simply looked down at the weeping, pathetic shell of the boy he had once sacrificed his life for. He did not pull his leg away, but his face remained completely carved from stone. "Family?" Silas asked softly, the word dripping with cold finality. 2 years ago, Vance, you told me that in the real world success goes to the strong. You told me that if I was failing, that was my problem, not yours. You told me my father died a long time ago." Silas reached across the marble table, picked up the expensive leather folder containing the $5 million acquisition contract, and calmly ripped it directly in half. "I didn't come here to save your company, Vance," Silas said, dropping the torn pieces of the contract onto the floor right in front of Vance's weeping face. I came here to buy the debt on this building. As of this morning, Aegis Medical owns this skyscraper. And my first order of business as your new landlord is liquidating Sterling Capital. The sound of the tearing paper echoed through the dead silence of the glass-walled boardroom like a gunshot. The shredded pieces of the $5 million contract fluttered slowly through the air, landing gently on the marble floor right in front of Vance's weeping face. The two towering executive assistants stepped forward without a single word. They firmly grabbed Vance by the arms of his cheap, fraying suit and hauled him effortlessly to his feet. He was no longer a venture capitalist king. He was a pathetic, trespassing fraud being removed from a building he no longer owned. "Dad. No. Please." Vance shrieked, his voice breaking into a hysterical, breathless panic as the guards dragged him backward toward the double oak doors. His polished shoes scrambled uselessly against the expensive flooring. "You can't do this to me. I'm your only son. I'll go to prison. Dad, please look at me." Silas did not look at him. He calmly picked up his silver-handled obsidian cane, adjusted his bespoke charcoal gray waistcoat, and turned his back on the screaming boy. "You destroyed your own life the exact moment you put a price tag on my heartbeat, Vance," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a life sentence. "Escort him off my property. And call the financial authorities. It's time Mr. Vance answers for his fraudulent debts." 15 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the towering skyscraper slammed shut. Vance was violently shoved out onto the busy, sunlit pavement, a small cardboard box containing his cheap office supplies tumbling onto the concrete. Vance scrambled to his hands and knees, sobbing uncontrollably, desperately trying to gather his scattered pens and unpaid bills. But before he could even stand up, the universe delivered its final, poetic stroke of absolute karma. A loud, furious screaming match was echoing down the sidewalk. Vance looked up through his blurry, tear-filled eyes. Standing next to a luxury sports car that was currently being hooked up to a city tow truck was Julian, the arrogant hedge fund manager who had mocked Silas at the penthouse, and Vivienne, Vance's gold-digging ex-fiancée. Julian's face was beet red, his $1,000 tie loosened as he screamed frantically into his cell phone. "What do you mean the fund is completely liquidated? You told me Sterling Capital's acquisition was a guaranteed lock. I heavily leveraged all of our clients' money on that deal. Aegis Medical just bought the debt. No, no, no. You can't freeze my accounts." Julian dropped his phone onto the pavement, his hands trembling violently. Because Julian had greedily tied his entire hedge fund to Vance's failing company, Silas's decision to tear up the contract hadn't just bankrupted Vance, it had instantly obliterated Julian's entire financial empire. Vivienne stared at Julian in sheer, unadulterated horror. She was wearing a massive diamond ring and holding expensive shopping bags, but the reality of her nightmare was setting in. "Julian, what is going on?" Vivienne shrieked, her voice shrill and panicked. "Why is the bank towing my car? You told me we were going to Monaco next week. Are you broke?" "We lost everything, Vivienne." Julian snapped, completely losing his high society composure. "Aegis Medical just bought out Sterling Capital's debt and zeroed us out. We are millions of dollars in the red. We're finished." Vivienne stumbled backward, dropping her designer bags onto the dirty sidewalk. She looked down and suddenly locked eyes with Vance, who was kneeling in the dirt, clutching a broken stapler. "Vance?" Vivienne gasped, her eyes wide with shock. Then, the horrific realization washed over her face. She remembered the name Aegis Medical. She remembered the rumor about the anonymous billionaire who had sold a massive industrial district for hundreds of millions of dollars. She remembered the old man in the corduroy jacket, and the brass key she had told Vance to throw in the garbage. "No," Vivienne whispered, her knees going weak as she realized the catastrophic magnitude of her mistake. Your father is the chairman of Aegis Medical? He was the billionaire?" Vance could only let out a pathetic, agonizing whimper, nodding his head as the wailing sound of approaching police sirens began to echo down the city block. The authorities were coming for him. Vivienne let out a blood-curdling scream of pure frustration. She had abandoned Vance because he went broke, only to marry Julian, who was now entirely bankrupt, completely missing out on a $300 million family fortune, because she had told Vance to throw a dying old man out into the street. She turned on Julian like a feral animal, slapping his chest, screaming that he had ruined her life, while the tow truck drove away with their last remaining asset. Vance sat alone on the curb, surrounded by the shattered, pathetic pieces of his ego, waiting for the police to put him in handcuffs. He had traded a father who loved him for a world that threw him away the second his pockets were empty. Back inside the grand, marble-lined lobby of the skyscraper, the atmosphere was entirely different. The vultures had been cleared out, and the true purpose of the day was finally revealed. Silas stepped off the private executive elevator, the high society corporate staff parting for him with immense, silent reverence. As he walked toward the exit, a young man stepped forward to greet him. It was Elias. Elias was the humble, hard-working janitor who had been emptying the trash in Vance's luxury penthouse building 2 years ago. He was the young man making minimum wage who had found the heavy brass key in the dumpster, recognized Silas from the lobby, and spent his own bus money to track the old man down and return it safely to his hands. Elias wasn't wearing a janitor's uniform anymore. He was wearing a sharp, meticulously tailored navy blue suit. When Silas had founded the Aegis Medical Investment Board, he didn't fill his executive team with ruthless corporate sharks. He sought out the people who possessed genuine integrity. He had paid for Elias's college tuition, mentored him, and proudly given him a seat on the board of directors. "The liquidations are complete, Mr. Silas," Elias said warmly, offering a deep, respectful smile. "And the funding for the new children's cardiac wing at the state hospital has officially been transferred. We are going to save thousands of lives this year." Silas looked at the young man, his eyes softening with a deep, unwavering paternal pride that Vance had forever lost the right to see. He reached out and placed a gentle hand on Elias's shoulder. "You did excellent work today, Elias," Silas said, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "You know, they say that blood is thicker than water. But I've learned that true family isn't determined by who shares your Dina. True family is determined by who stands by your side when you have absolutely nothing to offer them but your gratitude." Elias smiled, deeply moved by the old man's words. "Thank you, sir. Are you ready to head home?" "Yes, son," Silas smiled, tapping his silver cane on the marble floor. "Let's go." As the corporate staff erupted into a genuine, respectful applause, Silas and Elias walked out of the towering skyscraper together. They didn't need the validation of high society. They had something infinitely more valuable: an empire built on a foundation of absolute loyalty, unquestionable truth, and a love that could never be broken by a price tag. The meaning every moment has a meaning, but not every truth is easy to face. If this lesson resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe. Comment family first below if you believe that a parent's sacrifice is worth infinitely more than all the money and luxury in the world. This is Moments and Meanings by Anne, and I'll see you in the next story.